Oh, gotta do one thing here.
Church bell will peal with joy, hurrah, hurrah, welcome home our darling boy, hurrah, hurrah, the village of lads and lassies say with roses they will strew the way, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. Get ready for the Jubilee, hurrah, hurrah, we'll give the hero 3 times 3, hurrah, hurrah, the laurel wreath is ready now to place upon his loyal brow. We'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. Let love and friendship on that day, hurrah, hurrah, their choicest treasures then display, hurrah, hurrah, and let each one perform some part to fill with joy the warrior's heart, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. In 1861 for Bowles, in 1861 for Bowles, says I, in 1861 Abe Lincoln went to Washington, and we'll all drink stone blind, Johnny fill up the bowl. In 1862 for Bowles, in 1862 for Bowles, said I, in 1862 Navy took the rebellion through, and we'll all drink stone blind, Johnny fill up the bowl.
Good morning, everybody. It's 10 a.m. It's Thursday morning. Beautiful day outside. And based on that music, I think we got an interesting topic for tonight. So welcome to everybody. It's the time for the Parish Coffee Hour with Father Paul and friends. So let's get it started right off. I'm going to hand it over to Father Paul and get us going. Morning, Father Paul.
Morning, Deacon Tim, and good morning, everybody. Glad you're with us today. With us today are 3 of our priests from the diocese, Father Tom Farrell, pastor in Richmond, Father Mike Ramler, pastor in Louisa, and Father Pat Stewart, who's pastor at Pax Christi. Always a theme for us as we live our lives is to learn from history. And today we're going to be exploring the Civil War. Again, we don't gather necessarily as 4th grade scholars or 5th grade scholars, but we're all kind of interested in the Civil War, and we're certainly not going to take a romanticized approach to it. It's some pretty serious stuff as we talk about it. But also, it's very, very interesting. It's part of the fabric of who we are. And even as I speak, I'm sitting in my office in my residence, and built on the grounds of the Henry Clay Estate. So there's a lot of Kentucky history all around us. Well, guys, I'm glad you're with us today. We've got a variety of questions and a variety of topics that we can work with. Honestly, we could go with any of these topics for a pretty long time, and we've got designated first responders, and we'll address it that way in terms of the issues. And yet, if there's something that any of you feels compelled to say as we go along, let's have at it. We just want to trust the Spirit as we serve our community with our program today. If we get through all the questions that you've seen kind of mapped out ahead of time, that's great. But if not, we'll just work with what we got. And I think we got a great program today. So Tom, we'll just start off with you. How did you get interested in the Civil War?
When I was in elementary school, I think it was 7th or 8th grade that I was introduced to American history and the Civil War for the first time. I remember being fascinated by that. And then reading. You talked about the romanticized view of the Civil War. I was in the 8th grade when I discovered the 1937 Pulitzer Prize winning novel, Gone with the Wind, and which takes a sort of romanticized view of the war period. But I read that, and then later I discovered in downtown Cincinnati in a bookshop, I discovered a 3-volume set of letters, The Children of Pride, written by the members of one extended family out of Midway, Georgia, before the war, during the war, after the war. Somehow all those letters were saved and they were published in a 3-volume set, and I read that. So it was mainly reading that fed my interest until I got to the seminary. My theology was at Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg, Maryland, 13 miles from Gettysburg. So I was in paradise there. The Civil War was in my backyard. So, and I've been back to Gettysburg multiple times. So that's how my interest was fed.
Wow. Other comments? Well, Mike, what would be some of the most important lessons that the Civil War teaches us?
I think that, of course, we know that slavery was the great moral issue of the time. It split the country, political parties, communities, churches. For example, here in Louisa, we have 2 Methodist churches. They split in the 1860s over the issue of slavery. So we had a Northern Methodist and a Southern Methodist. And here we are in this current year, and there's still 2 churches, 2 Methodist churches in town. So they've never really reformed again. I have found that in the Civil War, there's nothing civil about it. Leading up to the Civil War, the parties involved had really stopped listening to one another. They didn't respect one another. They belittled one another. They put one another down. They saw no good in the other. And eventually it became a bloody conflict, which mangled both body and mind of the people who were involved in it. It's kind of sad when you look at it and realize that the Industrial Revolution would have put an end to slavery in a few decades anyhow, with the event of the steam tractor and the plows and the carbines and so on, because slavery would have been uneconomical. They wouldn't have been able to maintain it. Also found that there was a comment that I forget where it came across it, but it said that the Civil War was a rich man's war and a poor man's misery. And in my reading, I've moved more into the common everyday soldier in the Civil War, and just amazed at some of the stuff that they went through. I think today we find in our own country issues of immigration, abortion, and they seem to be separating. They seem to be splitting us. And maybe a lesson we can learn is the people prior to the Civil War stopped respecting and listening to one another, really listening to one another. And we may have that problem going on once again today. I'm not saying we're going to go into another bloody conflict like the Civil War, but still, when discourse breaks down, we find that people stop disrespecting one another, and there's nothing civil about that kind of an attitude. So again, a big question, and hopefully a short, quick little answer here.
It seemed like a lot was festering that the Civil War kind of brought to reality.
Eventually, yep.
Here, Mike talked about the churches being split. When I was assigned as the pastor in Danville, I discovered that the Presbyterian church there in Danville split apart over the issue of slavery. And so there were 2 Presbyterian churches in Danville for generations. And finally, I think it was in the 1970s or 80s that they reunited.
My understanding too is that in the Civil War that Berea affiliated with the Federals and Richmond affiliated with the Confederates. Is that an accurate reading?
Yes, I'd say so. And I didn't realize until I got to Richmond that there was a Battle of Richmond that took place shortly before the Battle of Perryville. And it was a defeat for the Union. The Confederates chased the Union soldiers down Main Street. Now, St. Mark's Church wasn't there yet, but we have a commemorative plaque out in front of our property commemorating the Sisters of Charity from Cincinnati, Ohio, who came down after the Battle of Richmond to nurse the wounded. And they were here for months. And when we put that plaque out there, the Sisters of Charity sent a busload of their nuns down for the occasion. So we have a little bit of Civil War history right here in our own backyard.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's striking, that there's so much throughout our nation, that these battlegrounds. Pat, what could you say about what set the stages for the Civil War? And we might even ask what it resolved and what was left unresolved. I need you to come off mute too.
There we are. Sorry.
Okay.
First of all, I just want to say it's good to see Mike Ramler there. I see you two guys way too often, but it's good to see you. It's good to see you, Mike. What set the stage?
Hope you're doing well.
I am. Thank you. Thank you. Very well. What set the stage is myriad things, but I'll just mention a couple quick. The newly founded Republican Party, it was made up of diverse groups that were not always in full agreement. There were the freeland people who wanted to be able to move to the West and were threatened by the idea that slavery might move into the West and take away their opportunity for free lands. There were the various forms of abolitionists. There were Northern economic powers, and all these together, which were not always in full agreement with each other, they were all a threat to the Southern culture and economy. So again, what set the stage for the Civil War was the debate over the conflict over slavery, and it's right there in all of the secession documents that the reason why they were seceding from the government was to protect slavery and the slave economy. And Mike's right. There were already signs that the slave economy was not feasible, but they were determined to hold on to it. And I mean, I'll just be real blunt here. All this business about states' rights, were simply a cover to protect their slave culture and their slave economy. What did it resolve? I guess I'm kind of cynical. I'm tempted to say very little. It didn't. It ended legal slavery, but it certainly did not end the racist culture of the South. And as we know, after a brief period that is called Reconstruction, pretty much the South was able to reinstate many of the racist practices that maintain that subservience and that maintain the power of a landed elite over both poor whites and poor blacks.
What do you think, guys? I sometimes think that it's related to almost a national arrogance that we can do anything we want to do. And it's what strikes me is it's not that many years from the Mexican War, which wasn't really a Mexican war. It was sort of like a colonial power move, to get some land that that the U.S. wanted, and almost like something in the U.S. psyche, whether it's south or north of the Mason-Dixon line, would be saying anything we want to do, we can do. It's almost like a manifestation or an overextension of the manifest destiny idea. I don't know if you guys would plug into that idea as even deeper than some of the the precipitating events that Pat's mentioned.
I would just say, I think the urge to extend slavery into the West from the Southern culture was one of the motivations of the Mexican-American War itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think it's significant that Abraham Lincoln, who was in I believe, the House of Representatives at the time, voted against the move to annex Mexico. He was one of the few. So an early sign of his integrity, that he recognized that this was wrong and he voted against it.
One of the things too that I think is helpful to draw out too is that the disrespect for African Americans was also felt in the North. Again, there wasn't the same kind of need for African American slaves in the North as in the South, and more of the abolitionist movement was in the North, of course. But there was still plenty of racism, I think, that would permeate the whole USA, whether North or South. Granted, it would be more significant in the South, but still, I think was all throughout. Does that make sense to you guys?
Sure.
Yes. In fact, for the first several years of the Civil War, the Union soldiers were not excited about the prospect of, they didn't feel like they were fighting to free the slaves.
Well, one of the things, of course, that's going on these days is there's a movement to remove memorials to slavery and its proponents and its defenders. Mike, how would you balance an interest in the Civil War with this commitment?
You like giving me the loaded question, Jerry.
Yeah.
I go with Tom. I started my interest in the Civil War back in probably the 7th or 8th grade. A friend up the street had a small little collection of Civil War items, bullets, some dice, and something else. From there, I came across my first book on the Civil War. It was about the bank raid up in Vermont. I can't remember the name of it. It was some Confederate agents tried to rob a bank up there to fund the South. And it was my first complete novel, I think, that I ever read in my entire, other than the classics illustrated comic books. And from there, my early years, I was fascinated particularly by the Southern leadership. So I read a lot, anything I could find, like on Stewart, on Stonewall Jackson, and so on. And it wasn't until a number of years later that I came across this theory or an understanding that was always there, I just wasn't aware of it, of the lost cause. The Lost Cause was an ahistorical presentation of the Civil War started by General Jubal Early of the South. And it was kind of building up an image of the Southern leadership, particularly in Lee's army, as these cavaliers out fighting insurmountable odds, and that they were trying to protect a way of life due to the just kind of anonymous Northern power, and they really couldn't defeat it because they had all these things going against them. The North was greater industrial, in an industrial sense. It had more manpower, and so that here were these guys really defending this, and started to realize that it was propaganda, that it was trying to rewrite history. And so then started to move more into looking at all of the officers on both sides, and found out none of them are saints. They all had their jealousies and their flaws and their faults. Some were good, some were mean, some were nasty. They all had various reasons why they were fighting. And then went on finding that it wasn't really until the early turn of the century that they started to put up the statues. And the statues started to go up in response to the lost cause. Here are our heroes. The South has been downtrodden. It's kind of on an economic downturn ever since the Civil War has taken place. Their way of life, the plantation way of life, which was horrible towards slaves, and not much better towards the isolated little farmer and the poor people of the South. um, that they started to kind of honor that and tried to say, well, slavery was benign. It really wasn't all that bad in the South and so on. And there was this grand old, like Tom said, gone with the wind kind of life in the antebellum mansions, and began to realize that they're putting these things up to remember that which really didn't exist. Later on, by the 1950s, they were putting them up somewhat in response to the growing civil rights movement in the States. And now we have come across a period in which, with Black Lives Matter and so on, that there's a real questioning about, do we uphold what's kind of a fiction anyhow? As Pat mentioned about the slavery and so on in the South, that it wasn't so much state rights. It was over trying to maintain a wealthy way of life for a small minority of people, because the majority of the Confederate soldiers did not own slaves, and they weren't rich by any stretch of the imagination. And when the war was over, their life wasn't going to be much better than it was prior to the Civil War. I think that the statues now, as they're coming down, and sadly, there's all kinds of statues and symbols that are going to be offensive to somebody. And we can end up maybe carrying this a little bit too far with the protesting religious statues. You hear some people wanting to change names of the saints of Catholic statues and so on, because that they were holders of slaves, or the attitudes that they had. And that I think the statues maybe have a place, but on the battlefields, they have a place maybe in the person's hometown. But one has to remember that they aren't saints. They're just ordinary human beings with all the faults and the foibles. For me, it doesn't bother me in my study or reflections on the Civil War, because, like I said, I've gone more into trying to get an attitude of just the common everyday soldier marching down the road, or living in the mud and the filth of the trenches around Petersburg. And I've always been fascinated. Paul and I talked about it some time ago. How on earth did you get men to line up shoulder and shoulder, walk within 100 yards of one another, and stand there and shoot at one another, knowing that hundreds are falling on either side of you? And what it really took to have that kind of courage, and what made that courage available. And maybe there's something in there that is honored, but we should never honor war. War is brutal, war is cruel, and ultimately it doesn't really result in solving a lot of the problems that we started to fight over in the first place.
Yeah, usually the result of a war is it sets the stage for the next war. What historic sites related to the Civil War have touched you most intensely? I think we can all probably comment on that in terms of some places that have impacted us. And want to start us off, Pat?
Yeah. Well, like Father Tom, I also went to Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg, Maryland. And so I would definitely say Gettysburg battlefield has had the most impact on me. Just countless days of being able to tramp over all even find the most obscure parts of that battlefield. And like the other fellas, when I was young, I found, just the kind of naive and again, sometimes racist movies that we watched as kids in the early 60s. Army movies and Westerns and so on. Dad would take us on day trips up to Wright-Patt Air Force Museum and to the Armor Museum over at Fort Knox. And so it was part of that culture to be kind of fascinated by military things. Certainly after World War II, that kind of idealization of military life had a big influence. The first books I discovered, just in passing, were Bruce Caton's two trilogies, one on the Civil War and one on the Army of the Potomac. So it was a big side benefit to be in Emmitsburg for those years. And my point is, just tramping on that field got me more and more into that question of the lives of the ordinary soldiers, as Mike talks about what those experiences were like to cross that field, to line up with these men, to endure these horrible wounds. And sometimes to wonder, why are we doing this? Sometimes not even thinking about it. Where did these men come from? What happened to them when they went home? So those kind of historic sites brought me to that more personal kind of desire to confront the human cost on individual lives as well as on whole communities. Actual monuments, and I'll just say this, actual monuments to Confederate heroes on courthouses, on university campuses, I'm in favor of them all going. But I would not like to see those monuments change on the battlefields themselves. It's more about what happened on that day and what Longstreet did on that day, or whatever. So I hope that much of the monuments on the Civil War battlefields would be maintained, but I'd be happy to see all those Confederate monuments go in those more public spaces. And quickly, Tom, we were also relatively close to Antietam as well. And what I liked about Antietam is that there were very few monuments. You were kind of on your own. There was a guided tour that you could buy and roads through, but there were far less monuments. And I thought that was interesting too.
Yes, many of my summer vacations have been to Civil War battle sites. I've been to Vicksburg, that was very moving. And then I've been to Antietam too, and I got to stand in what's called the Bloody Lane. And it's overpowering to think that, there was all this carnage and bloodshed, so much so that they labeled this place the Bloody Lane. So very moving to go to these places. It gives you it confirms your sense that there is such a thing as sacred ground. I sensed it at Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Antietam, Bull Run. You get to these places and it's almost as if what happened there has left an imprint on the land.
Sure, yeah.
Now, several of you have talked about reading about the common soldier. I haven't pursued the common soldier as much as I happened to come across the slave narratives that were put together during the 1930s, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. They sent journalists into the South to interview elderly former slaves and get these firsthand accounts of what it was like to live under that system. And there are volumes of them now. I've got them in my library, and it's fascinating to read these firsthand accounts of people who actually lived under slavery.
Mike, any comments on special places?
I've been to just about every battlefield east of the Mississippi River, some of them a few times. I think it's sad that you go to some of them and you find out really how little is left of the place because of the encroachment of society and the land values. I think in going to some of these places, and I agree with, I think a couple mentioned, I kind of like the battlefields that are more austere, not a whole lot of monuments, not a whole lot of statues. Get the CD player or whatever you can get and stick it in the car and just go on your own pace and drive through the things. But one thing I had never realized until I got there, and there isn't much left of it, is the Franklin battlefield in Tennessee, just prior to the Battle of Nashville. And that the actual charge of the Confederates there against the Union lines had greater, almost by 2 or 3 times the number of injuries, casualties than Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. And of course, Pickett's charge is kind of like the iconic charge of the Civil War. And to say, well, most people read and hear about the war in Virginia, some of the wars out west. Tom mentioned Vicksburg, Franklin, you've got Stones River, Atlanta, and so on, were much more important for the defeat of the Confederacy. Lee was kind of blocking Richmond, just as the Army of the Potomac was blocking Washington. But it was the Army out west that captured the most and tore the interior out of the Confederacy, which made it no longer viable for it to survive. So I kind of appreciated those battlefields out in that area that you just don't hear that much about.
Yeah, yeah. Chickamauga is pretty well preserved and has a lot less of that monumentalism as well.
Yeah.
I think the Civil War characters, and very often we're talking about beyond the common soldier, you know, the generals. Who's of most interest to all of you? Tom, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by Robert E. Lee, especially because he was faced with such a moral dilemma at the outset of the war. They actually offered him, he could have been, you know, head of the Union Army, and he went back to Arlington and paced the grounds, and he just couldn't bring himself to think of fighting against his fellow Virginians. So finally, his love of the state of Virginia, you know, swayed his decision, and he ended up being head of the Confederate Army instead of the Union Army. But you know, he agonized over that decision, and I've always appreciated that it was such a moral dilemma for him.
I've got a photo of him hanging on my wall in my office, and in some ways, it's a tribute to, like you say, the integrity of the man, and also a reminder that good people make bad choices.
Yes.
You know, and it is a fact, and also that from a leadership standpoint, I think he operated in such a way that he and Jackson could. And Stonewall Jackson could almost read one another's mind in terms of the next movement of strategy and things like that. And once he lost Jackson, he still operated the same way, but you know, the lieutenant generals underneath him didn't react the same way as Jackson. He wasn't nearly as effective without him. So, anyways.
For myself, the general is Thomas. George Thomas of the Union. He's involved in a lot of the important incidences. He always seems to be overlooked.
Yeah.
It was he who saved the day at Chickamauga. He earned the name the Rock of Chickamauga because of his defense that allowed the Union to retreat. And then he was the one who was at led the Battle of Nashville. But he was kind of a steady, dependable kind of a guy. It was his troops who took Missionary Ridge at outside of shoot. I've lost my Chattanooga. There you go. And he doesn't really get the acclaim, but he's just some guy that's always there and seems to be very dependable.
Mike, George Thomas was the Union general that saved the day at a small but significant battle at Mill Springs outside Somerset as well.
Well, and he was, I think I guess it was the 1880s, the city of Fort Thomas was named for him, or the fort that became eventually the foundation for the city was named for him.
Yeah.
Northern Kentucky. And course, it's impossible for the four of us as natives of Northern Kentucky not to be natives of Northern Kentucky, and we know some of the stuff that's part of our heritage too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's right. In Devou Park to this day, you can see the trenches that they dug to protect the invasion of Cincinnati from the south, which
That's
never
right.
really happened, but they were ready for it.
Yeah, it was before there was I-75. The Southern troops were going to come up Highway 25, the Dixie Highway, which of course would be in Lexington, Georgetown Road, and they were, working their way towards an invasion of Ohio through Cincinnati, and General Lew Wallace organized many people and conscripted. They're instantly drafted, I think, about 10,000 freed African-American men to be part of a development project, a construction project to make the fortifications. And anyway, as Henry Heath leading the Southern Army, which was a small army, when his scouts saw all that, they basically didn't do much of anything. They just had a few skirmishes and then turned back and went south.
Can I, not to drag this out, but you're talking about those kind of sites, and my mentioning of Mill Springs, military cemeteries, many of them founded, originating in the time of the Civil War. There's a military cemetery at Mill Springs at Nancy, outside of Somerset. And I can't say the one on outside of Nicholasville.
Camp Nelson.
Camp Nelson, of course.
Yeah.
It's always feels very special to have a graveside ceremony in a military cemetery. And of course, now Camp Nelson is associated as a training ground for Black troops, federal soldiers in the Civil War as well. Go ahead, Paul.
I'd say related to the Civil War, as we're talking about cemeteries, it's somewhat of the aftermath, and somewhat of the time frame leading in was the Underground Railroad, and throughout Kentucky, and particularly along the Ohio River. Again, I would suggest for our viewers fascinating sites and the experiences in the Augusta, Kentucky, Maysville area, all along there, and certainly even in Central Kentucky, there's pockets of the Underground Railroad. Well, we've named some of the figures that we are most interested in. I guess there's also that question of, well, who would you like to learn more about of the Civil War characters? Who's kind of, fascinating? There's like hints of something that would be of help in our own journeys, just to get a feel for them. And who would you like to learn more about, Pat?
I saw that question, and I can't settle on any particular character that I'd want to do more study of. So I don't have much for you on that one, Paul.
Okay.
Here, I can jump in. Someone I'd like to learn more about is Father William Corby, a Holy Cross father who volunteered early in the war to serve as a chaplain with the Irish Brigade out of New York. And he was with them. There's a famous incident on the second day of the fighting at Gettysburg. Before the fighting began, Father Corby climbed up on a stone and granted absolution to all the soldiers. There's the picture. Granted absolution to the soldiers, and it said that even the non-Catholic generals on their horses took their hats off and held their hats over their hearts. This was so moving. And later, I believe it was in 1891 that the painting was done to commemorate that event. And there is a statue of Father William Corby on the same boulder on the battlefield at Gettysburg You can see it to this day. They erected a statue in memory of him, and he's extending his hand as if giving absolution. And Father William Corby would later go on to become the president of Notre Dame University.
Oh,
And 20 years after the war, he wrote his memoir, especially to counter a lot of the anti-Catholic feeling that was prevalent at the time. He wanted to testify to the fact that, hey, Catholics were part of this too. We were on the Union side. We shed our blood. So someone actually gave me a copy of his memoir, and I've never read it. So one of these days, I want to get around to reading the memoir of Father William Corby.
Yeah, I've read that. I would recommend that. Yeah. Mike, anybody hit you from this standpoint you'd like to learn more about?
not anybody that would be notable. As I said, my activity has been more into finding things that talk about the everyday life. I've come across a whole series of their historical fiction writers, and I find that some of these guys can take the dryness of reading about the maneuvers and about the tactics and about who was there and who did what, and talk about the guys in the trenches or in the fields going into. So for example, there's a guy by the name of Ralph Peters. He's got about a 4 or 5 series on the Civil War, but they're written from the point of view of, he talks about just soldiers you've never heard of. I mean, most of them are fictional characters, but he stays pretty faithful to the historical reality. Another is the Sheras, the father and son, that series of books. And then another one, actually, I think he's an English writer, Bernard Cornwell. He has about 4 or 5 novels on the Civil War, but they're all done from the point of in perspective of the common soldier. But he brings in, like, well, these generals met, and this guy was kind of standing off to the side. And there are some historical fictions out there that I don't like at all, because they take and alter the historical reality, or they have people doing, the generals and that, doing things that would not be what these guys would have done. It kind of besmirches their history, their reality. So I think anybody wanting to get interested in the Civil War to try some of these historical novel series, because they just aren't as dry as some of the
Yeah, I agree. Just from my own standpoint, Lew Wallace was a general with the Union, and was the writer of Ben-Hur. Never really became a member of a church, and yet was very religious. And again, he guided the preservation of Cincinnati at the time of the possible invasion. And then there's an Episcopalian who became dedicated to going to chapel services when he was at West Point, and served in the Mexican-American War, named Leonidas Polk. And then after he finished his term in the service, went in the seminary and became an Episcopal priest, and then an Episcopal bishop. And then as he was a bishop in the South, when the war broke out, he gathered something in the way of an army and re-enlisted as a general, and eventually was killed in battle, and or not in battle, but he was killed during the war as he was reconnoitering. And he presided at the marriage of John Morgan, among other things. And his biography is by Joseph Parks, is very praiseworthy of him as such a noble guy. And then an article in, I think, Civil War Times Illustrated kind of paints the picture of a pompous, self-promoting person who wasn't a very good soldier at all. Polk was also part of the team of Braxton Bragg at Perryville. So I'd like to learn more about him because of the conflict, and then also just that fascinating thing of believing that, God's will is that the South prevail, and therefore here's the thing to do. So lots of character studies, that are part of all this. Let's talk about central and eastern Kentucky. How were our areas involved in the war? Mike, want to take it from there?
Compared to states like Virginia, Georgia, Mississippi, Kentucky wasn't all that involved. I guess the two most notable features for the central part of the state was the two invasions by the Southern armies coming out of Tennessee. First was very, very early. There was the attempts to keep Kentucky in the Confederacy where it was moving towards the Union. And there was the battle out at Island Number 10, which is no longer an island on the Mississippi, but I believe it's part now of Missouri with the way the Mississippi has moved around. There's a small little remembrance at Columbus out on the Mississippi. But then for the central part of the state, there was the Battle of Mill Springs, which Pat alluded to earlier, in which General Thomas was the leading general on the Union side. And they stopped a proposed invasion into the state in January of 1862. And then, of course, the one that you're referring to with the protection of Northern Kentucky was the invasion that ended at Perryville in October of 1862. Then the other things that took place were kind of more minor, but they were Morgan's raids, again, coming out of either Virginia or coming out of Tennessee. And his most notable is he attempted to, we actually did cross into Indiana and went out behind Cincinnati and then was captured as he was trying to come back in across the Ohio River in eastern Ohio. I had been helped at the chaplaincy at the Ohio State Penitentiary when I was in the seminary there. And of course, Morgan and some of the other ones were imprisoned at the Ohio State Penitentiary and they escaped from there. So, and they made their way back south. So I had a little affinity with John Hunt whenever I went into the Ohio State Penitentiary, and they said, okay, you're in here now, work with these inmates, and all those doors clang behind you. And you're thinking, I could scream and cry all I want, they're going to let me out of here. I was appreciative of what he had done. In eastern Kentucky, there really isn't a whole lot over here. The most notable was it's not quite east, it's more in the central, was Wildcat Mountain, just outside of
East Bernstein?
I'm like, please?
East Bernstein?
East Bernstein, yeah, that area there. Then we find that there was Ivy Mountain, which was a small, I mean, these things are so small and there's so few men participating in them, they wouldn't even be considered skirmishes by the time you've gone through Shiloh and some of the other bloodlettings that took place. But Ivy Mountain was a Union victory. We find that there were maybe 20 casualties, wounded and injured. Later on, in January of '62, there was a little battle outside of Prestonsburg at Middle Creek, which there's maybe a couple 3-acre memorial that you can go see is present there. It had about a total of 70 casualties on both sides, but again, it was a Union victory. The rest of it over here was pretty much some minor guerrilla activity. Nothing that went on, say, compared to Kansas and Missouri during the Civil War. One of the myths that seemed to have developed was because of this guerrilla activity over here, it was the foundation for some of the feuds. The most notable feud, of course, being the Hatfields and the McCoys, which when you compare it to any number of other feuds in Kentucky, the Hatfields and McCoys was a nothing feud. Only about maybe 11 guys got killed in that feud. But then you go over to Rowan County and you go over to Clay County and you find Rowan might have had somewhere in the 80s of people killed, but they were for more economic reasons, for power within the county, and the struggles between the post-Civil War Democratic and Republican parties that brought about these. And then eventually, some of them, like the Hatfields and McCoys, we don't even know how it started. Some say it was over the Romeo and Juliet aspect. Others say it was over a pig. Others say it was because there was a struggle over land and the timber to cut off of these, to be harvested off these lands. But it seems like the more modern writings on these feuds are saying they weren't necessarily Civil War born. That doesn't mean they didn't have some flavor in there, but the primary cause wasn't North and South. So that was pretty much it for Kentucky.
What do you guys feel, in Kentucky, that there was more of a split in terms of soldiers' involvement? There's always this image of, two brothers, one fighting for the North, one fighting for the South. And, I think the Breckinridge family had some splits. Would you say that would, for a state that remained neutral when it's all said and done, were the common soldiers kind of split between both armies, or how would you respond to that?
There's certainly in the Western theater, there certainly were units from Kentucky on both sides. I don't know any specific instances where the Kentucky units literally faced each other on a battlefield. And there were of cases of common soldiers, of brothers being on either side. And you don't hear a whole lot about that in Kentucky anymore, do you?
No.
I mean,
I think it would be percentage-wise a stronger phenomenon in a place like Kentucky than, say, Mississippi or New York.
Of units from on both sides.
Yeah,
sure. But
Speak a little bit to that. Looking back at our genealogy, in the study the lady in the family did on that, found that there were 4 brothers from Northern Kentucky who are my, I guess, 2 times great uncles. One fought for the South and 3 of them fought for the North. And the only reason the guy fought for the South was that he happened to be in New Orleans when the war broke out. So he just joined the Confederacy. In the library that I have and in doing some research, I was able to figure out, because one guy lost his left arm, another guy lost his right arm, and I could figure out about where on the battlefields, and they were both in Georgia, that these guys were injured. Where their unit was and about what time of the day that their unit was. So I can kind of say, well, gee, in history on my grandmother's side, we did have a split family.
For goodness sakes.
In the North and one brother in the South.
Wow.
I think it was significant that Mary Todd Lincoln's own family was divided over this.
Yeah.
She had brothers and stepbrothers, and if I'm not mistaken, most of them were Confederates, but there were some, and of course she was on the Union side. So her own personal family was divided.
Let's talk a little bit about church stuff. How was Christianity involved in the Civil War and also the Catholic Church? Want to say a few things about that one, Pat?
Yeah, but just, I feel like I need to keep it real simple. The Catholic Church was becoming more and more the church of immigrants, of course, in the 40s and 50s and into the 1860s. And that's also kind of a separate issue on our agenda for today. That was a complicated issue too. And unfortunately, the Catholic Church in the United States, the hierarchy in the United States was divided as well, just the way the country was. There were bishops in the South who were pro-slavery and who supported the secession cause. I think that's a sad comment on our history. I try to give a bit of leeway to trying to put things in the context of the time. but by the 1860s, I don't think there was any context left even in the 1860s to honestly support, to be able to support that Southern cause. And so I think it was our own Catholic sadness. So I'm just going to leave it at that for now. Others will have thoughts on this too.
Yeah, the first thing I thought of was the involvement of Catholic nuns as nurses. When the war broke out, the majority of trained nurses in the United States were Catholic nuns.
Wow.
Who ran a network of 28 hospitals at the time. So they volunteered in great number to nurse the wounded. There was a Sister of Charity out of Cincinnati who went south to nurse the wounded. She became known as the Florence Nightingale of the Civil War, and she's never been forgotten. In fact, she was so revered by the soldiers that when she died, I think she died in the 1890s, she was given a military guard and buried with military honors.
Oh.
And these nuns were oftentimes the first contact with the Catholic Church that some of these soldiers ever had. And it did a lot to dispel anti-Catholic feeling. And there's a diary that one soldier kept. He wrote that this nun was so wonderful to him that he said to her, "Are you really a member of the Catholic Church?" He said, "I've heard horrible things about the Catholic Church." And she said, "Yes, it gives the greatest meaning to my life." And he said, "Well, if you're a Catholic, I'm going to have a better opinion of Catholics from now on."
There's the story too of wounded soldiers from either side. If they knew they were being taken to a healthcare facility or a camp where sisters were working, they just knew that they would be in good hands, that they would be cared for, and they realized that that there was just like an extra level of dedication that the sisters had to care for them and to respect them. One of the things that stands out to me is that again, for maybe reasons that are beyond us here, the abolitionist movement wasn't a strong Catholic movement. There was probably more of a movement in the Catholic Church at the time to move towards like a gradualism rather than an instant freedom of those who were slaves. And again, as with a lot of things historically, there's more than one way to read that. But I think that's the fact that most of the abolitionists were coming from places beyond Catholicism. In fact, many of them were anti-Catholic, which probably would forestall something in the way of an allegiance with them too. In the Civil War, there was particularly in the North, there was a draft going on. I just think of, again, getting back to the common person, somebody comes to the US, say from Germany or Ireland, hopefully getting a new start in life. And lo and behold, this war breaks out and they're drafted. There's the movement of people, the rich people who could, in a sense, pay their way out of the draft and get somebody else to take their place in the army. Can you comment on some of that as we look back on what that meant to the folks coming in as immigrants, that this war is going on? And can you start us off on that one, Mike?
As Pat alluded to earlier, that's a very complicated, complex issue. It kind of boil it down to the Irish famine, which caused a lot of people from Ireland to come to this country, and also the various revolutions that took place in the 1840s and 50s in Europe, which those who lost were fleeing, particularly Germans coming into the country. By and large, they came into the big eastern cities, most notably New York. And there weren't many immigration laws in those days, not like anywhere near what we have today, because most of the immigration laws we have today didn't start until the 1920s. So when they came in, particularly the Irish found a lot of prejudice. The signs up that you see, Irish need not apply. So they were economically distressed. And when the Civil War came along, a lot of these Irish and Germans joined just because they were going to get a paycheck and get paid and so on. And some of them joined because they saw in the South a threat to their view of democracy, because they thought this was the plantation owner who was kind of like the nobleman back in Europe. And they really didn't want to have anything to do with that. So they joined for that reason, the Union. There were probably close to 200,000 German immigrants, some of them right off the boat. There was another 200-something thousand Irish, some of them again right off the boat. Others who were second generation. In the South, you find that there aren't that many immigrants in the war, because they have come into New Orleans. There's not that many, and they live in New Orleans and along the Mississippi River, like Memphis. And so there's only about 70,000 immigrants, and most of them are second generation immigrants, not people fresh off the boat. They participate in the battles. But again, it seems to be more economic than real commitment to causes.
All right. Well, thank you. Well, guys, we've pretty much arrived at our time of closure. This has been a great conversation. Again, lots can be said more on so many of these topics, but it's a reminder to us that we do need to trust the wisdom of our history and lessons we can learn from our history, and far from romanticizing the terribleness of it, but to learn from the lessons and to move into the future. So to each of you, Mike and Pat and Tom, thank you so much. It's been I hope a good program for everybody who's been with us. And I stressed at the beginning, we're not great scholars, any of us, in terms of the Civil War, but there's been a lot of sharing of wisdom here. So thank you so much. And, Deacon Tim, can you flash up what our program is going to be next week?
Yep, there you go.
And next week we'll be talking about the YMCA. It's a whole different topic, of course. That's going to be, I think, interesting as we talk about the ministry of the YMCA and how it got started and what it means to people today. And we'll be going in a few different directions, I think, even as we go on. Our guest is Greg Kupar. Many of us who go to the High Street YMCA see him at 5:30 in the morning or 6 o'clock when we come in. And he's the most cheerful guy that you ever want to meet at that time of day, and helps us all get started with our approach to physical and mental and spiritual fitness. So should be a great program next week. Thanks again for being with us. And again, thanks to the three of you guys. We could stay on just a minute or two. We'll debrief, and we just ask God's blessings. And as we close, let's pray in a special way for mothers, and especially mothers who have lost sons or daughters in the midst of wars. We all know folks like that, so we'll pray with them and for them as we conclude with a simple Hail Mary. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death.
Amen. Amen.
Again, thanks everyone. Glad
Thanks,
you're with us.
Paul.